In the heart of New York City, where skyscrapers kissed the clouds and luxury cars lined the streets, there lived a man named Charles Whitmore. He was one of those people everyone knew about, rich, powerful, and always in control. His penthouse on the Upper East Side was like something out of a magazine: marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and windows that offered a view of the entire city. But beneath all the glitz and glamour, life wasn't as perfect as it seemed. Charles had built his empire from scratch. Starting with nothing but determination and a sharp mind, he climbed his way to the top of the business world. People admired him for his success, but behind closed doors he was a different person altogether. He could be cold, distant, and often dismissive of those who didn't meet his high standards. This side of him came into play especially when it came to his family, or rather, part of it. Years ago, Charles married Evelyn, a kind-hearted woman who brought warmth to his otherwise calculated existence. They were happy at first, traveling the world, attending fancy events, and enjoying everything money could buy. But there was one thing missing: a child. For years they tried to have kids, but fate had other plans. After countless doctor visits and sleepless nights, Evelyn suggested adoption. At first, Charles resisted. The idea of raising someone else's child didn't sit well with him. But eventually he gave in, not because he wanted to, but because he couldn't bear to see Evelyn so heartbroken anymore. Their journey led them to Ghana, where they met a bright-eyed girl named Amara. She was only 6 years old, then full of energy and curiosity despite growing up in an orphanage. Her dark skin glistened under the African sun, and her laughter filled the room whenever she spoke. Evelyn fell in love with her instantly. There was something about Amara, her spirit, her resilience, that made Evelyn believe she was meant to be part of their family. Charles, however, remained skeptical. He agreed to adopt her, but deep down, he never fully accepted her as his. Back in New York, life changed dramatically for the Whitmores. Evelyn poured all her love into making Amara feel welcome. She decorated her room with colorful curtains, bought her new clothes, and even surprised her with a shiny black piano and instrument Evelyn hoped would help Amara express herself. Music had always been a big part of Evelyn's life, and she believed it could bring joy to Amara too, and she was right. From the moment Amara touched the keys, it was clear that she had a natural talent. She practiced every day, sometimes for hours, losing herself in melodies that seemed to flow straight from her soul. But while Evelyn cheered Amara on, Charles kept his distance. He barely acknowledged her presence, let alone her efforts. To him, Amara was just another responsibility, someone he tolerated because Evelyn insisted. He didn't understand why she spent so much time playing the piano, or why she smiled so brightly when she mastered a difficult piece. Instead of encouraging her, he mocked her quietly. "That won't get you far in this world," he'd mutter under his breath whenever she played. Or worse, he'd roll his eyes and walk away, leaving her feeling small and insignificant. Despite his harsh words, Amara refused to give up. She clung to the piano like it was her lifeline, using it to escape the loneliness she sometimes felt. It wasn't easy being the adopted daughter of a billionaire who treated her like an outsider. At school, she faced challenges too. Some kids teased her for being different, pointing out her darker skin or asking why her dad didn't look like her. But Amara learned to ignore them, focusing instead on her music and the bond she shared with Evelyn. Evelyn did her best to bridge the gap between Charles and Amara. She reminded him how lucky they were to have such a talented and loving child. "She's special, Charles," she'd say. "Can't you see that?" But Charles shrugged off her words, dismissing them as sentimental nonsense. Over time, the tension between them grew. Evelyn felt torn between her loyalty to her husband and her devotion to her daughter. Meanwhile, Amara struggled to find her place in a home where she often felt invisible. Things reached a breaking point one evening during dinner. Charles had come home late from work, stressed and irritable. When Amara shyly mentioned that she'd been invited to perform at her school's annual recital, he scoffed. "Another performance? What's the point?" he snapped. "You're wasting your time with these silly hobbies." Evelyn shot him a disapproving look, but before she could say anything, Amara stood up quietly, tears welling up in her eyes. Without a word, she left the table and retreated to her room. That night, Evelyn confronted Charles. "How can you treat her like that?" she demanded, her voice trembling with anger. "She's our daughter, whether you like it or not. She deserves better than this." Charles didn't respond immediately. He stared at his plate, guilt flickering across his face. But instead of apologizing, he simply walked away, leaving Evelyn standing alone in the kitchen. As days turned into weeks, the atmosphere in the Whitmore household grew heavier. Evelyn tried to smooth things over, but the cracks in their family were becoming impossible to ignore. Amara continued to practice her piano, pouring her pain and frustration into every note. She dreamed of a day when her father would finally see her for who she truly was, not just some charity case, but a young girl with dreams and potential. Little did they know, that day was closer than any of them expected. A single event would soon force Charles to confront the truth about himself and his family. Until then, Amara held on to hope, believing that someday, somehow, her music would speak louder than words ever could. Life in the Whitmore household carried on, but it felt like a storm was brewing beneath the surface. Evelyn tried her best to keep things together, but the tension between Charles and Amara was palpable. Every day seemed to stretch longer than the last, filled with unspoken words and missed opportunities for connection. Despite everything, Amara kept herself busy with her music. The piano became her safe haven, a place where she could escape the weight of her father's disapproval and let her emotions flow freely. One afternoon, as Evelyn flipped through a stack of invitations on the dining table, something caught her. It was an elegant envelope embossed with gold lettering. She opened it carefully and read the contents aloud to herself. "The annual Manhattan Charity Gala," she murmured, her eyes lighting up. This wasn't just any event, it was one of the most prestigious gatherings in the city, attended by celebrities, philanthropists, and influential figures. The theme this year was Celebrating Talent, and the evening promised live performances by some of the world's finest musicians. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. An idea began to form in her mind, an idea that might finally give Amara the recognition she deserved. She turned to Charles, who was sitting nearby scrolling through his phone. "What do you think about attending this gala?" she asked, holding up the invitation. Charles barely glanced at it before shrugging. "If you want to go, fine," he said dismissively. "But I'm not wasting my time watching boring performances." Evelyn didn't let his indifference deter her. She knew how important these events were for networking, but more than that, she saw an opportunity. "What if Amara performed there?" she suggested cautiously. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant, as if she expected him to shut the idea down immediately. Charles looked up from his phone, his brow furrowing. "Amara? At a charity gala? You've got to be joking." His tone dripped with sarcasm. "She's not ready for something like that. Besides, no one will care about some amateur playing the piano." His words stung, but Evelyn refused to back down. "You're wrong," she said firmly, surprising even herself with her boldness. "Amara is incredibly talented. If you'd take the time to listen to her instead of dismissing her, you'd see that. This could be a chance for her to shine, to show everyone what she's capable of." For a moment, Charles didn't respond. He stared at Evelyn, his jaw clenched, clearly irritated. But then, after a long pause, he sighed. "Fine," he muttered. "Do whatever you want. Just don't expect me to applaud." Though his agreement came grudgingly, Evelyn felt a spark of hope. She hurried to Amara's room, where the young girl was practicing yet another challenging piece. When Evelyn told her about the gala and the possibility of performing, Amara's eyes widened in shock. "Me? Perform there?" she whispered, her hands frozen over the keys. "I can't do that. What if I mess up?" Evelyn knelt beside her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You won't mess up," she said gently. "You're amazing, and people need to hear your music. This is your chance to prove to everyone, including your father, just how special you are." Amara hesitated. The thought of playing in front of such a large audience terrified her. But deep down, she also felt a flicker of excitement. Maybe this was her moment to step out of the shadows and show the world what she was made of. After a few moments of silence, she nodded slowly. "Okay," she said, "I'll do it." Over the next few weeks, Amara threw herself into preparation. She chose a piece by Rachmaninoff, one of the most technically demanding compositions ever written. It was risky, given her age and experience, but she wanted to challenge herself. Every day after school, she practiced for hours, her fingers flying across the keys as she memorized every note. Sometimes Evelyn would sit beside her, offering encouragement and reminding her to breathe. Other times, Amara practiced alone, letting the music carry her away. Charles, meanwhile, acted as though the whole thing didn't exist. He rarely mentioned the gala or Amara's performance, and when he did, it was with thinly veiled disdain. "Still working on that little project of yours?" he'd ask sarcastically during dinner. Amara learned to ignore him, focusing instead on perfecting her piece. She knew his opinion wouldn't change overnight, but maybe, just maybe, her music could plant a seed of understanding in his stubborn heart. As the date of the gala approached, anticipation built in the household. Evelyn helped Amara pick out a navy blue gown that complemented her complexion, and arranged for a professional makeup artist to style her hair. Amara felt like a princess, though nerves still gnawed at her stomach. What if the audience hated her performance? What if her father continued to look at her the same way he always had? On the morning of the gala, Evelyn woke up early to make sure everything was ready. She checked and rechecked the schedule, ensuring they wouldn't be late. Charles, however, seemed indifferent. He went about his usual routine, barely acknowledging the significance of the day. As they prepared to leave, Evelyn pulled Amara aside for a quiet moment. "Remember why you're doing this," she said softly. "Not for him, but for yourself. Show them who you really are." Amara nodded, taking a deep breath. She stepped into the car with her parents, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and excitement. The drive to the venue felt endless, each passing streetlight bringing her closer to the unknown. When they arrived, the sight of the grand ballroom took her breath away. Chandeliers glittered overhead, and elegantly dressed guests mingled beneath them, their laughter filling the air. Amara clutched Evelyn's hand tightly, suddenly feeling very small in such an opulent setting. As they made their way inside, Charles scanned the crowd with his usual air of superiority. He exchanged polite nods with acquaintances and accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. Amara, on the other hand, stayed close to Evelyn, trying to blend into the background. She noticed the curious glances people gave her, the subtle raised eyebrows and whispered comments. She couldn't tell if they were intrigued or judgmental, but either way, it made her feel uncomfortable. Finally, the MC announced that it was time for the first performance of the evening. A renowned violinist took the stage, captivating the audience with a soulful rendition of a classic piece. One act followed another, each more impressive than the last. Then, just as dessert was being served, the MC returned to the microphone. "And now," he said with a warm smile, "we have a very special guest. Please welcome Amara Whitmore, who will grace us with a performance on the piano." A hush fell over the room as Amara stood up. Her legs felt like jelly as she walked toward the stage, but she forced herself to keep moving. The spotlight hit her as she sat down at the grand piano, its gleaming surface reflecting the chandelier above. For a brief moment, she closed her eyes, blocking out the sea of faces staring back at her. She thought of all the hours she'd spent practicing, all the times she'd doubted herself, and all the love Evelyn had poured into supporting her. And then, with a deep breath, she placed her fingers on the keys. The first notes rang out, clear and precise, silencing any lingering chatter in the room. What happened next would leave an indelible mark not just on those watching, but on the Whitmore family itself. The grand ballroom fell silent as Amara's fingers touched the keys of the gleaming black piano. For a moment, it felt like time stood still. The chatter of elegant guests faded into nothingness, replaced by an electric anticipation hanging in the air. Every eye was on her, some curious, others skeptical, but none could deny the quiet confidence with which she sat at the instrument. Her back was straight, her hands steady, and though her heart raced beneath her chest, her face remained calm. Amara took a deep breath, letting the world around her dissolve. She wasn't thinking about the crowd anymore or the whispers that had trailed her since she entered the room. Instead, she focused on the music, the piece she'd poured her soul into mastering for weeks. This wasn't just another performance. It was her chance to speak without words, to let her emotions flow freely through every note. And when the first chord rang out, clear and resonant, something magical happened. The room seemed to hold its collective breath. Rachmaninoff's composition was notoriously difficult, filled with intricate passages and dramatic shifts in tone. It demanded not only technical skill but also raw emotion, a depth of feeling that many seasoned musicians struggled to convey. Yet here was Amara, barely 14 years old, playing as if the piano itself were an extension of her body. Her fingers danced across the keys with precision, each note flowing seamlessly into the next. There was no hesitation, no faltering, only pure mastery. As the melody swelled, so did the audience's astonishment. People who had initially doubted her ability now leaned forward in their seats, captivated by what they were hearing. The music carried them away, weaving a story of resilience, pain, and triumph. Some closed their eyes, letting the hauntingly beautiful strains wash over them. Others exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of awe and disbelief. Even the waitstaff paused mid-step, unwilling to miss a single moment of this extraordinary performance. Evelyn watched from her seat, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. She had always believed in Amara's talent, but seeing her shine like this in front of hundreds of people was more than she could have hoped for. Her heart swelled with pride as she realized how far her daughter had come. From the shy little girl who once tiptoed around Charles's disapproval to the confident young musician commanding the stage, Amara had grown in ways Evelyn never imagined possible. She clasped her hands together tightly, praying the moment would never end. Charles, however, sat frozen in his chair. His glass of champagne rested untouched on the table beside him, forgotten. He hadn't expected much from Amara's performance, just another amateur attempt destined to embarrass them both. But what he heard defied all his expectations. Each note struck a chord within him, forcing him to confront feelings he'd buried long ago. Guilt, regret, and even admiration bubbled to the surface, leaving him unsure of how to react. For the first time in years, he truly listened not just to the music, but to the person behind it. When the final note echoed through the ballroom, there was a split second of silence before the audience erupted into applause. It started with a few scattered claps, then grew louder and more thunderous until the entire room was on its feet. Strangers cheered, whistled, and shouted their approval, creating a wave of sound that filled the space. Amara sat motionless for a moment, overwhelmed by the response. Then, slowly, she rose from the bench and turned to face the crowd, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment, but a small smile tugged at the corners of her lips. She scanned the sea of faces, searching for one in particular. When her eyes met Evelyn's, she saw nothing but love and pride radiating back at her. It gave her the courage to look further, to find Charles sitting stiffly in his seat, his expression unreadable. His gaze locked onto hers, and for the briefest moment, Amara thought she saw something flicker in his eyes. Was it surprise, regret, or maybe respect? The MC returned to the stage, urging everyone to take their seats as the evening continued, but the energy in the room had shifted. Conversations buzzed with excitement, and several guests approached Evelyn to congratulate her on Amara's breathtaking performance. "She's incredible," one woman gushed, shaking Evelyn's hand. "You must be so proud." Evelyn nodded, unable to form words through her tears. Meanwhile, Charles retreated into himself. He barely acknowledged the well-wishers who stopped by their table, offering compliments about Amara's talent. Instead, he stared blankly at the tablecloth, replaying the performance in his mind. How had he missed this? How had he failed to see the depth of her potential? All those times he'd mocked her, dismissed her efforts, treated her like she didn't belong, it all came rushing back, hitting him like a tidal wave. By the time the gala drew to a close, Charles was visibly shaken. He avoided eye contact with both Evelyn and Amara during the car ride home, lost in his own thoughts. Amara, on the other hand, couldn't stop smiling. Despite the nerves that had plagued her earlier, she felt lighter now, as if a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that she was good enough, that her music mattered, that maybe, just maybe, she could earn her father's approval after all. When they arrived back at the penthouse, Evelyn hugged Amara tightly, whispering words of praise and encouragement. "You were amazing tonight," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so proud of you." Amara hugged her back, feeling a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. But as she pulled away, her eyes drifted toward Charles, who stood awkwardly near the doorway. His usual air of authority was gone, replaced by an uncharacteristic vulnerability. For a moment no one spoke. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Finally, Charles cleared his throat and stepped forward. He began, his voice hoarse. He hesitated, struggling to find the right words. Then, with visible effort, he looked directly at Amara. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "For everything," Amara blinked, stunned. She hadn't expected this, not tonight, not ever. Part of her wanted to lash out, to remind him of every cruel comment, every dismissive glance. But another part of her recognized the sincerity in his voice. He wasn't apologizing out of obligation. He meant it. Slowly, she nodded. "It's okay," she replied softly. "I just want you to see me for real. Not as someone you have to tolerate, but as your daughter." Charles swallowed hard, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I do see you," he said, his voice cracking. "And I'm sorry it took me so long." With that, he stepped closer and wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into an embrace. It was awkward and unfamiliar, but it was also genuine, a tentative step toward healing the rift that had divided their family for so long. That night, as Amara lay in bed, she replayed the events of the evening in her mind. She thought about the standing ovation, the glowing compliments, and most importantly, her father's unexpected apology. For the first time in years, she went to sleep with a sense of hope. Things wouldn't change overnight, but tonight marked the beginning of something new, a chance to rebuild, reconnect, and move forward together. Little did she know, this was only the start of a journey that would transform not just her relationship with Charles, but the entire Whitmore family. The days following the charity gala felt different in the Whitmore household. There was an unspoken shift in the air, a quiet acknowledgement that something monumental had happened. Amara's performance hadn't just stunned the audience, had cracked open the walls Charles had built around himself, forcing him to confront the person he'd become. For years, he'd prided himself on being successful, powerful, and in control. But now, for the first time, he realized that his wealth and influence meant little if he couldn't even connect with his own family. Charles spent hours alone in his study, replaying the events of that night in his mind. He thought about how effortlessly Amara had commanded the stage, how she'd silenced a room full of skeptics with nothing but her talent and determination. He remembered the way people had cheered for her, their applause echoing like a chorus of redemption. And then there was Evelyn, his wife, who had stood by him through thick and thin, despite his coldness and neglect. Her unwavering belief in Amara had been a mirror reflecting his failures as both a husband and a father. One morning, Charles decided to take action. He couldn't undo the past, but he could start making amends. His first step was small but significant. He began attending Amara's practice sessions. At first, he sat quietly in the corner of the living room, watching as she played. She didn't acknowledge him at first, focusing intently on the keys, but after a few days she glanced over at him curiously. "Why are you here?" she asked. One afternoon, her voice tinged with suspicion. "I want to understand," Charles replied honestly. "I've spent so much time dismissing your music, but now I realize it's a part of who you are. If I'm going to be a better father, I need to learn what matters to you." Amara hesitated, unsure whether to trust him. But over time, she opened up, explaining the nuances of each piece she practiced, the emotions behind the melodies, the challenges of mastering certain techniques. Charles listened carefully, asking questions and even offering encouragement when she hit a tough spot. It wasn't perfect, and there were moments when old habits threatened to resurface, but they were slowly building a bridge between them. Evelyn noticed the change too. She saw how Charles made an effort to include Amara in conversations, asking about her day or complimenting her progress on the piano. He started joining them for family dinners instead of retreating to his study. And though his attempts at bonding sometimes came across as awkward, they were genuine. Evelyn couldn't help but feel hopeful. For the first time in years, their home felt less like a house divided and more like a place where love might finally flourish. But Charles knew he had work to do beyond just mending fences with his family. He recognized that his prejudice ran deeper than just his treatment of Amara. It was rooted in years of privilege and ignorance. Determined to grow, he enrolled in diversity workshops and began reading books recommended by Evelyn about racial equality and systemic bias. These experiences weren't easy. They forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself and the world he lived in. Yet, with each session, he gained a clearer understanding of why Amara's journey mattered, not just to her, but to everyone who faced discrimination because of their skin color or background. As weeks turned into months, Charles also started using his resources for good. He used his connections to sponsor programs for underprivileged children, ensuring they had access to education, mentorship, and opportunities to showcase their talents. One of these initiatives included funding music scholarships for kids in underserved communities. When Amara heard about it, she smiled softly and said, "That's really nice of you." It wasn't effusive praise, but it meant the world to Charles. He knew earning her trust would take time, and he was willing to wait. Amara, meanwhile, continued to thrive. Encouraged by her newfound confidence, she auditioned for prestigious music competitions and earned invitations to perform at venues across the country. Each success brought her closer to achieving her dream of attending Juilliard, the renowned performing arts school. Watching her shine filled Evelyn with immense pride, while Charles found himself marveling at her resilience. She wasn't just talented. She was strong, determined, and kind of reflection of qualities he admired, but had failed to nurture within himself. Despite the progress, there were still moments of tension. Old wounds don't heal overnight, and Charles occasionally slipped back into patterns of dismissiveness or impatience. But what set this new chapter apart was his willingness to apologize and try again. When he snapped at Amara during a heated discussion about her future career plans, he later pulled her aside and said, "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have spoken to you like that. You deserve better from me." Amara accepted his apology, recognizing that true growth comes not from perfection, but from effort. Their relationship deepened further when Charles accompanied Amara to one of her performances outside the city. It was a modest event held in a community center, far removed from the glitz and glamour of the Manhattan Ila. As they drove together, Charles admitted, "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm nervous for you tonight." Amara laughed lightly, touched by his concern. "Don't worry," she teased. "I won't embarrass you." When she took the stage, Charles watched with bated breath, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. This time, however, his nerves weren't born out of doubt. They stemmed from a father's pride and fear of seeing his child face rejection. When the audience erupted into applause at the end of her performance, he joined in enthusiastically, clapping until his palms stung. Afterward, as strangers approached to congratulate Amara, Charles stood by her side, beaming with pride. For the first time, he introduced her as "my daughter" without hesitation or reservation, back at home. Evelyn observed these changes with gratitude. The man she had married, the ambitious, driven individual who once seemed untouchable, was learning to soften. He was becoming someone who listened, who cared, who loved deeply. Their marriage, which had been strained for so long, began to blossom anew. They spent evenings talking about their hopes for Amara's future, reminiscing about their early years together, and dreaming of a life where their family could truly heal. By the time Amara received her acceptance letter from Juilliard, the Whitmores had transformed into a united front. The news brought tears of joy to Evelyn's eyes and a proud smile to Charles's face. That evening they celebrated with a quiet dinner at home, raising glasses of sparkling cider in a toast to Amara's achievements. You've worked so hard for this, Charles told her sincerely. I'm honored to call you my daughter. As Amara prepared to leave for college, Charles reflected on how far they'd come. He remembered the little girl who had once tiptoed around his disapproval, afraid to make a sound. Now, she was a confident young woman ready to take on the world. Through her music, she had taught him lessons he never expected to learn about humility, forgiveness, and the power of unconditional love. On the day Amara packed her bags for Juilliard, Charles helped her carry boxes to the car. As he loaded the last suitcase into the trunk, he paused, looking at her with a mixture of pride and nostalgia. Promise me something, he said gently. No matter where life takes you, don't ever stop playing. Your music has changed us. Oh, Amara smiled, her eyes glistening with emotion. I promise, she replied. And with that, she hugged him tightly, knowing that no matter what lay ahead, she carried her family's love and their hard-won redemption with her. Amara's departure for Juilliard marked the beginning of a new chapter not just for her, but for the entire Whitmore family. The days leading up to her move were bittersweet. Evelyn spent hours helping Amara pack, folding clothes neatly and taping boxes shut, while Charles hovered nearby, offering assistance whenever he could. Though none of them said it out loud, they all felt the weight of this transition. For years, their lives had revolved around each other, even when tensions ran high. Now, as Amara prepared to leave the nest, they realized how much she had become the glue holding them together. On the morning of her departure, the penthouse was unusually quiet. Evelyn busied herself making breakfast, though her hands trembled slightly as she cracked eggs into a bowl. Charles sat at the dining table, scrolling through his phone, pretending to be calm, but his knuckles were white from gripping the edge of the table too tightly. Amara, meanwhile, stood by the window, staring out at the city skyline. She tried to focus on the excitement of starting fresh at Juilliard, but a lump formed in her throat every time she thought about leaving her parents behind. When it was finally time to go, they loaded the car in silence. Each item carried a memory. The photo frames Evelyn insisted on packing, the sheet music Charles had carefully tucked into a folder, the small teddy bear Amara had kept since childhood. As they drove toward the airport, no one spoke much. The hum of the engine filled the gaps between them until Evelyn broke the quiet with a soft question. Are you nervous? Amara nodded, then smiled faintly. A little, she admitted, but I think I'll be okay. Evelyn reached over and squeezed her hand. You'll do great. You've worked so hard for this. Her voice wavered, but she forced herself to stay composed. Charles glanced at Amara through the rear-view mirror, his expression unreadable. He wanted to say something, anything to reassure her, but words failed him. Instead, he focused on driving. Gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than usual, at the airport, the farewell was brief but emotional. Evelyn hugged Amara tightly, tears streaming down her face. Call me every day, she whispered. And don't forget to take care of yourself. I will, Amara promised, returning the hug just as fiercely. Then it was Charles's turn. He hesitated for a moment before pulling her into an embrace. Make us proud, he said gruffly, his voice thick with emotion. Amara blinked back, tears, and nodded. Thank you for everything, she replied softly as she walked away. Dragging her suitcase behind her, both Evelyn and Charles stood watching until she disappeared into the crowd. When they returned home, the penthouse felt eerily empty. Evelyn wandered from room to room, touching the furniture and glancing at the spaces where Amara's belongings used to be. Charles retreated to his study, sitting in silence as memories flooded his mind. They had raised her, fought for her, and now she was gone, but not truly. Her presence lingered in every corner of their home, in the echoes of her laughter, and in the melodies that still seemed to hang in the air. Months passed, and life settled into a new rhythm. Amara thrived at Juilliard, immersing herself in her studies and performances. She sent regular updates to her parents, sharing videos of her recitals and photos of her dorm room. Each message brought a sense of pride and relief to Evelyn and Charles. They marveled at how quickly she adapted to her new environment, finding her footing among peers who shared her passion for music. Yet despite her success, Amara never forgot where she came from. In her letters, she often expressed gratitude for their support and for the changes they had made as a family. For Charles, these reminders were especially poignant. He continued attending workshops and volunteering with programs aimed at uplifting underprivileged youth. His efforts weren't just about redemption. They were about creating opportunities for others like Amara kids, who might otherwise be overlooked because of their circumstances. One evening, after speaking at a charity event, a young girl approached him shyly, clutching a worn notebook. "I want to play the piano," she said timidly. "Do you think I can?" Charles knelt down to meet her eye level. "Of course you can," he replied gently. "If you work hard and believe in yourself, there's nothing you can't achieve." As he handed her a brochure for a local music program, he felt a surge of hope. Maybe, in some small way, he was paying forward the lessons Amara had taught him back at home. Evelyn and Charles found solace in rediscovering their relationship. Without the constant tension surrounding Amara, they began reconnecting in ways they hadn't in years. They took long walks together, cooked meals side by side, and talked late into the night about their dreams for the future. Evelyn reminded Charles of the man she fell in love with, the ambitious dreamer who once believed anything was possible. And Charles, in turn, vowed to be that man again, not just for her, but for himself. During one of these conversations, Evelyn posed a question that lingered in the air for days. "Do you think we did enough?" she asked quietly. "For Amara, I mean. Do you think she knows how much we love her?" Charles thought for a moment before answering. "I think she does," he said. "But loving someone isn't just about saying it, it's about showing it. Every day, in big ways and small. That's what matters." Evelyn nodded, comforted by his response. They had made mistakes, so many mistakes, but they had also grown. Together, they had learned to see beyond their biases, to listen instead. Dismiss, and to embrace the beauty of imperfection. Their journey wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that made all the difference. The following summer, Amara returned home for a visit. Stepping off the plane, she looked older somehow, more confident. Her hair was styled differently, and she carried herself with a quiet assurance that hadn't been there before. When she spotted her parents waiting for her at baggage claim, she broke into a wide grin and ran toward them. Dropping her bags in the process, Evelyn wrapped her arms around her tightly, laughing through tears. "Look at you," she exclaimed. "You're glowing." Charles stepped forward, his eyes shining with pride. "Welcome home," he said simply, pulling her into a hug. For a moment, none of them spoke. They just held on to each other, savoring the reunion. Over the next few weeks, Amara reacquainted herself with the city she grew up in. She visited old friends, explored familiar places, and spent countless hours practicing on the same piano that had sparked her love for music. One afternoon, as she played a piece she'd been working on at Juilliard, Evelyn and Charles sat side by side, listening intently. When she finished, they applauded enthusiastically. "That was incredible," Evelyn gushed. "You've gotten even better," Charles nodded in agreement. "It's amazing how much you've grown, not just as a musician, but as a person." Amara smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "Thanks to you guys," she said. "I couldn't have done it without your support." Later that evening, as they sat around the dining table sharing stories, Charles raised his glass in a toast. "To Amara," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "for reminding us what truly matters, for teaching us to see the world and each other through different eyes, and for proving that love can overcome anything." Tears welled up in Evelyn's eyes as she clinked her glass against his. "To our family," she added, "imperfect but whole." Amara joined in the toast, her heart swelling with gratitude. She knew their journey hadn't been easy, but it had brought them closer than ever. Through pain and forgiveness, misunderstanding, and growth, they had built something stronger than any wealth or status could provide, a bond rooted in unconditional love. As the night wore on and laughter filled the penthouse once again, Amara realized something profound. Her music had always been a way to express herself, but it had also become a bridge, a means of connecting hearts and healing wounds. And as long as she kept playing, she knew her family would continue to grow, learn, and thrive together. The end.